What's the scariest thing that's happened to you? Getting a phone call from my boyfriend's best friend that he had been hit by a car. I lived on the other side of the country at the time, but luckily we had already planned a visit and I was getting on a plane to go there in a few hours. His best friend was on the phone with him when he was hit, managed to figure out what had happened and what hospital he would likely to be taken to. Then he contacted me and picked me up at the airport and took me to the hospital. I can't imagine what he heard on the phone, but I'm so glad he has such an amazing best friend. On a lighter note, because it was raining, his last words before being hit were, "Oh shit, my umbrella!" So this one's straight up weird, but I swear it's true. I had gotten my very first apartment back in 2006. It was a one-bedroom upstairs with a side entrance that had steps leading up to my door. You had to walk through 2 doors to access it, a private entrance if you will. Anyway, I was living alone for 6 months before my fiancé moved in, was working 2 jobs to maintain rent, etc., and started noticing the door to my entrance would be left open despite being locked. The apartment also had a basement area that served as a laundry/storage room. About 3 months in, I kept hearing footsteps at night. I'd be woken up by the door creaking slowly, etc. I thought I was just being paranoid until one night I looked out of my window and saw a lady standing in the parking lot staring at my window. I thought nothing of it. Maybe she was looking for the person downstairs or whatever. Well, long story short, my landlord never changed the locks or gave me an updated key. This woman was the prior resident, and I woke up one night to grab a Gatorade to rehydrate when out of effing nowhere, someone sprints past me in the kitchen, shoulder checks me and bolts downstairs into the darkness. Now, I had no camera and no footage, so I didn't call the police, but I immediately called my landlord and demanded the locks get changed. I explained what happened and he apologized profusely and even sent me a $50 gas card and $100 off my rent next month. Locksmith came next morning while I was at work and the landlord left a note explaining this. Remember that side door downstairs I told you about that leads to the laundry room? Well, that 29-year-old woman was actually living downstairs and had been sneaking into my apartment with her key every night to steal my food and hang out on my couch. Dead serious. I found this out because the landlord found her in the storage closet. She tried running past him and he tackled her to the ground, identifying her and closing the case. While driving down the freeway with my friends, we were clipped by a car changing lanes. We were sent into a spin and ended up in the fast lane facing the wrong direction. I was in the backseat and still remember the sight of the cars coming to a sudden brake to prevent us from being in a head-on crash. Was a senior in high school while I was in the passenger seat and my friend was driving. We were merging onto the freeway and were clipped on the back bumper, which sent us spinning across 3 lanes of full traffic. I remember looking at the car directly behind us, while spinning and facing the wrong direction, and then I looked over and we were going full speed towards the median. I covered my eyes because, in my mind, if the glass shattered, I didn't want it to get into my eyes. We hit hard. Miraculously, didn't hit any other cars. The airbags flew out and knocked the wind out of me. I blacked out for a second, and when I came to, my friend was screaming and trying to climb over me to get out because the car hit on her side. My automatic reaction? Laughing. When I could finally get us out of the car, thankfully no major injuries, but I still have a crooked finger to this day due to the airbag. The woman who clipped us was crying and said she was so sorry and was trying to let us in. When the cops and EMT came, she said we cut her off. There was only one lady that I'll never forget. She pulled over in her truck, let us in, and safely took us to the other side of the freeway. Bless her soul. We were so scared. Cops talked to us and had one witness who stayed, who was on a motorcycle. I shit you not, they said he seemed a little loopy and under the influence, so they didn't take his statement. The birth of my son. My wife had to have a C-section when our oldest was born, so she had some complications with the second pregnancy when she had my son. One night she comes out after dinner and says she's bleeding. We called the doctor, who said to get to the hospital ASAP. We dropped everything and went. Dropped my wife with the nurses at the front of the hospital and parked my car. By the time I made it inside, they had 2 lines in her and were prepping for emergency surgery. I was able to walk with her to the door of the operating wing, but then they told me I couldn't come. Spent 3 hours pacing in the waiting room. When a nurse finally came out, they told me my wife died on the table twice. The complications caused her uterus to rupture during the C-section and she lost 7 units of blood. They more or less had her stabilized after removing her uterus and she was in the ICU recovery. Still couldn't see her. Asked about my son. He inhaled a mouthful of amniotic fluid on his way out and was in the NICU under observation. A couple of more hours and they finally let me see my wife because she was partially awake and screaming for me. She spent 2 days in ICU, 4 in trauma recovery, and 5 in inpatient while she stabilized. My son was okay after 4 days in NICU. Her doctor told us flat out the trauma her body went through was equal to being hit by a train. All in all, she had 9 units of whole blood, 8 units of plasma, and 5 units of platelets transfused before she finally stabilized. Saw the doctor last year as a customer at my work. I walked over and gave her the biggest hug in the world and thanked her again for giving me my wife back. I will never forget her and will always be thankful for that amazing woman. I was in a bus that crashed into a house. I was trying to nap after a late-night flight when suddenly the bus shook, so I opened my eyes and saw us going off the road, knocking down a small tree and then colliding with the house. There was a strong smell of gas, so we thought the bus was going to explode. We all had to get out through the fire escape window, and I cut my hand on broken glass when I landed. Thankfully, the bus didn't explode and everyone got out with only minor injuries. Nobody was home in the house either. 40 years ago, I got home very drunk at night. The police had my house staked out waiting for me and tackled me in the driveway and took me to jail for burglary and attempted rape that they accused me of. I spent 3 days in jail before they figured out that I was innocent and just cut me loose about an hour from my home without my wallet, which they still had at the county jail that I was originally booked into. Didn't have a cent on me, but I was sure happy to be out. Being on a bus in central London on 7/7. Had traveled up from Bristol early morning to attend a work meeting, and as the taxi queue was massive, we decided on the bus. Bus moved a little, but it was obviously gridlock. Internet access wasn't a big thing on mobiles then, so it took one of my colleagues having a phone call with a friend to find out there had been a bomb on the tube. I called my mom to say that I was in London, but not to worry as I was on a bus and safe. Then, of course, the bomb went off on the bus. With the mobile networks all bottlenecked, my mom couldn't get through, so she left a message. Honestly, the scariest thing was hearing the utter panic in her voice as she spoke. I can still hear it now, just begging me to get off the bus. We got off at Marble Arch and walked back to Paddington. Work excused us from the meeting. We managed to catch the last train out of London back to Bristol that day and were given the rest of the day off. I went straight to my mom's and held her for hours. London has held no joy for me since. As a kid, I made a makeshift zipline between 2 trees in my yard with some rope and an old shirt. I went to go across it just after the sunset one summer night, and my shirt was caught on a broken-off branch from behind and started choking me. I thought I was as good as dead because I couldn't yell very loud due to being choked. I held on to the zipline shirt for dear life when I saw one of my older brother's friends walking down the sidewalk. He saw me hanging and got my shirt off the branch. Saving a woman's life. I was walking past my building's pool on the way home from the parkade when a guy flagged me down and yelled, "I think she's drowning." I remember very little of what happened next, but I pieced together that I ran like hell to get there. Jumped in, fully clothed, phone in pocket, grabbed her from the front. Hot tip: don't grab a drowning person from the front, they will climb you, and got her out of the pool. I was in no danger, but after the crisis was over, fear washed over me like I could not believe. I cried in the shower for an hour until I finally calmed down. I would do it again in a heartbeat.